When silence shows up, the mind rushes to fill in the worst conclusions. You start telling yourself that because she isn't calling, texting, or checking in, you must already be erased. But that assumption misunderstands how emotional memory actually works. Silence doesn't wipe people out of our minds. If anything, it removes distractions and forces the mind to sit with what was never fully resolved. When noise disappears, thoughts get louder, and when routine contact ends, the emotional weight of a connection often becomes clearer, not weaker. Most people confuse forgetting with self-control. Just because someone chooses not to reach out doesn't mean the feeling is gone. It often means they are managing it privately. Processing doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks quiet. It looks like restraint. It looks like someone replaying moments alone rather than expressing them out loud. The absence of communication isn't proof of indifference. Many times it's proof of internal conflict. Human attachment doesn't shut off on command. The brain is wired to revisit emotionally charged experiences, especially when they end without closure. When contact stops, the mind naturally searches for meaning. It replays conversations. It re-examines decisions. It asks questions that were never asked out loud. Silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, what mattered starts to stand out more clearly. That's why people often think about someone more after they leave than when they were still around. There's also something important about distance. When you are present every day, your value blends into routine. But when you're gone, the space you used to fill becomes noticeable. Silence highlights absence, and absence highlights impact. The things you brought into her life, your consistency, your energy, your attention, don't vanish. They become contrast. And contrasts are powerful. They force awareness. They create moments where she realizes something is missing without immediately knowing what it is. Silence also gives emotions room to evolve. In the beginning, reactions are often defensive. Pride, distraction, or relief can mask deeper feelings. But once time passes and emotional pressure drops, the truth surfaces. That's when processing really begins. That's when the mind revisits what felt safe, familiar, and real, not because she wants to go backward, but because the mind naturally returns to what once mattered when it's no longer trying to protect itself. And here's the part most people miss: your silence plays a role too. When you don't chase, explain, or demand reassurance, you allow space for reflection. You're no longer influencing her emotions in real time. You're no longer shaping the narrative. That forces her to confront her own feelings without your presence guiding them. Silence removes control, and in that loss of control, clarity often emerges. This is why assuming you've been forgotten is usually a projection of your own anxiety, not a reflection of her reality. Emotional memory doesn't operate on surface behavior, it operates on impact. And impact doesn't disappear just because communication stops. Silence is not the end of thought, it is often the beginning of understanding. So if the quiet feels heavy right now, don't rush to fill it with fear. Let it be what it is. Because silence doesn't mean you didn't matter. It often means you matter enough to be processed in private. People often assume that time erases everything, that once messages stop and routines break, the memory of a person slowly fades into nothing. But that belief ignores how the human brain actually stores emotional experiences. We don't remember people by the number of conversations we had with them. We remember them by the way they made us feel in moments that mattered. Emotional imprints don't dissolve on a schedule. They stay dormant, waiting for the right trigger to bring them back to the surface. Think about it. Most details of daily life disappear quickly. What was said on a random Tuesday, what someone wore, or the exact words of an old conversation often vanish. But the feeling of being understood, respected, or emotionally safe doesn't vanish with the same speed. That kind of experience gets stored deeper. It becomes associated with comfort, excitement, or stability. And once something is tied to emotion, it becomes resilient. It doesn't need constant reinforcement to survive. That's why forgetting you isn't as simple as finding someone new or staying busy. Distraction can keep the mind occupied, but it doesn't rewrite emotional memory. Even in new situations, the mind subconsciously references past experiences to evaluate the present. If you created a strong emotional environment, one where she felt seen, valued, or emotionally connected, that environment becomes a benchmark. Then benchmarks don't disappear. They influence perception long after the situation ends. Emotional imprints also have a way of resurfacing at unexpected times. A familiar song, a place, a tone of voice, or even a quiet moment can bring everything back without warning. Not because she's trying to remember you, but because the brain links emotion to sensory memory. That's why someone can feel over it for weeks, even months, and then suddenly feel a wave of nostalgia they didn't invite. Emotional memory isn't logical, it's associative. What makes this even more powerful is that emotional imprints often grow clear with distance. When a connection ends, the mind stops reacting and starts evaluating. It filters out the noise and remembers the essence. The arguments fade faster than the warmth. The tension fades faster than the security. Over time, the emotional core of what you represented becomes more defined. That doesn't mean idealization, it means clarity, and clarity strengthens memory, not weakens it. This is also why trying too hard to remind someone of your presence can actually dilute your impact. When you constantly reinsert yourself, you shift from being an emotional reference point to just another ongoing stimulus. But when you step back, the emotional imprint has space to stand on its own. It no longer competes with daily interaction. It exists as a memory, and memory, when tied to emotion, has weight. Many people mistake silence for emotional absence. In reality, silence often protects emotional presence. It allows feelings to settle into memory rather than being overwritten by conflict, overexposure, or emotional noise. If what you offered was genuine, consistent, and emotionally real, it left a mark. And marks don't vanish just because contact ends. So if you ever wonder whether you were easy to forget, remember this: people forget routines, not resonance. They forget words, not feelings. And emotional imprints, once formed, don't fade quietly. They wait. When you leave someone's life, you don't leave behind a blank space, you leave behind a comparison. And comparison is one of the most powerful psychological forces there is. While you were present, your energy, your standards, and the way you showed up became part of her normal. But once you're gone, that normal disappears, and the mind immediately starts measuring everything that follows against what came before. That's where you quietly re-enter her thoughts, not through memory alone, but through contrast. At first, the mind resists this process. Distraction feels easier than reflection. New faces, new routines, and new conversations can create the illusion of forward motion, but illusion doesn't last. Eventually, the brain looks for familiar emotional patterns to evaluate what's happening now. It asks simple but powerful questions. Does this feel as safe? Does this feel as genuine? Does this feel as consistent? And whether she wants it to or not, you become the reference point those questions are measured against. What makes absence so effective is that it reveals what can't be replaced easily. Anyone can fill time. Very few people fill a role. When you're gone, the space you occupy becomes obvious in moments that don't announce themselves. When something good happens and there's no one to share with the same way, when a conversation lacks depth, or when emotional support feels surface level. These moments don't scream your name, but they quietly remind her of the standard you set. Comparison also removes the emotional fog that often exists during a relationship. While you were there, small flaws may have felt bigger, and appreciation may have been diluted by familiarity. Distance changes perspective. Without daily exposure, the mind stops reacting and starts evaluating. It separates what was temporary from what was foundational. And in that evaluation, your strengths tend to stand out more clearly than they ever did while you were present. This is why moving on isn't always a clean break. It's often a series of silent realizations. Each new interaction becomes a test, even if she doesn't label it that way. And every time the test falls short, your absence becomes louder. Not because she wants you back, but because the mind is wired to recognize patterns. Once a certain level of emotional connection has been experienced, it becomes difficult to accept less without noticing the difference. There's also something important about how you leave. When you walk away without drama, without bitterness, and without trying to prove your value, you don't give the mind a negative narrative to cling to. You don't make it easy to dismiss you. Instead, you leave behind an open-ended question. And open-ended experiences are the ones the mind revisits the most. They invite comparison because they were never fully resolved. Over time, this process doesn't make her obsessed, it makes her aware. Aware of what felt rare, aware of what felt grounded, aware of what's missing without being able to name it immediately. And awareness is often the first step toward reflection. Not loud reflection, not emotional reaction, but quiet, honest acknowledgement. So if you think disappearing makes you forgettable, understand this absence doesn't erase value, it exposes it. When the comparisons begin, your presence is no longer taken for granted, it's remembered for what it truly was. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing that closure comes from explanations, long conversations, or emotional confessions. In reality, closure is something the mind creates when it feels it has all the information it needs. And when you leave without over-explaining, without chasing, and without trying to control the outcome, you deny the mind that sense of completion. That's where curiosity is born. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that lingers. When you pull away calmly, you disrupt expectations. Most people expect reactions, questions, emotional appeals, reassurance, or resistance. When none of that happens, the brain struggles to categorize the experience. It asks, did he care less than I thought? Followed closely by, or did he care enough not to fight? That uncertainty keeps the mind engaged far longer than any emotional outburst ever could. Curiosity thrives in unanswered questions. There's something psychologically powerful about restraint. When you don't rush to prove your worth or explain your intentions, you allow your actions to speak instead. Silence becomes information. It suggests confidence, self-respect, and emotional stability. And those qualities are difficult to dismiss. Instead of providing a clear ending, you create a mental pause, And the human mind hates unresolved pauses. It returns to them again and again, searching for meaning. What's important here is that curiosity isn't about manipulation, it's a natural response to incompleteness. When you remove yourself without drama, you remove emotional noise. That forces her to reflect on what she experienced rather than what you said. Words can be argued with, behavior is harder to reinterpret. Your calm exit leaves her with a single undeniable fact. You didn't need to convince her of your value. This is also where the idea of moving on too easily gets misunderstood. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about not centering your life around someone who chose distance. When she senses that you didn't fall apart, that your life didn't pause, it challenges assumptions. The narrative shifts from needed me to chose himself. And that shift sparks curiosity because it reframes your role in her mind. The absence of emotional chasing also removes the comfort of finality. When someone begs, explains, or seeks validation, the mind often categorizes them neatly and moves on. But when someone exits with composure, there's no neat box to place them in. Were they hurt? Were they done? Did they outgrow the situation? Those unanswered questions keep resurfacing, not because she wants to reopen the past, but because the story feels unfinished. Over time, this curiosity doesn't demand attention, it waits, it shows up during quiet moments, it surfaces when something reminds her of you or when life slows down enough for reflection. And because you didn't exhaust the connection with emotional excess, the memory of you remains clean, not tangled in conflict, not buried under resentment, just unresolved enough to be revisited. So understand this clearly. Closure doesn't come from saying everything, sometimes it comes from saying nothing at all. And when you leave without trying to control how you're remembered, you often become unforgettable. Most people believe that if you're not visible, you're forgotten, that if you're not posting, explaining, or reminding someone of your presence, you slowly disappear from their awareness. But real growth doesn't need an audience. In fact, growth often speaks loudest in absence. When you step back and focus on stabilizing yourself emotionally, mentally, and personally, you send a message without ever sending a word, and that message carries weight. Growth changes the story someone tells themselves about you. During a breakup or separation, people often create narratives to justify distance. They tell themselves you were dependent, stuck, or unable to move forward without them. That narrative creates comfort, but when time passes and there's evidence, direct or indirect, that you're doing well, that story begins to crack. And when a narrative cracks, curiosity and reflection rush in to fill the space. You don't need to announce improvement for it to be felt. Energy shifts are subtle but noticeable. The way you carry yourself, the calm in your responses, the absence of bitterness, these things register. Even silence, when paired with stability, communicates confidence. It says, I didn't need chaos to feel okay, and that kind of composure is rare. Rare things are remembered. What makes growth so powerful is that it reframes your absence. Instead of being seen as loss, it begins to look like strength. When someone realizes you didn't crumble, didn't spiral, and didn't try to pull them back into something they walked away from, respect quietly enters the picture. And respect is far more lasting than attention. Attention fades quickly, respect lingers. Growth also removes the need for validation. When you stop seeking reassurance from the person who left, you reclaim your center. That shift is felt even from a distance. It changes the emotional dynamic retroactively. Suddenly, past moments are reinterpreted. Things that once seemed ordinary begin to look grounded. Your restraint becomes maturity. Your silence becomes self-control. And those qualities tend to gain value over time, not lose it. There's also an unexpected effect of growth. It challenges identity. If she believes she was the emotional anchor, the one holding things together, seeing you thrive disrupts the belief. It forces a reevaluation, not out of regret, but out of awareness. The realization that you were capable of standing on your own changes how she remembers the connection. It shifts the balance from dependency to mutual choice. This is why trying to prove you're doing well often backfires. Performance feels hollow. Genuine growth doesn't need validation because it's internally anchored, and that authenticity is sensed. When someone grows quietly without resentment or theatrics, it creates a contrast that's impossible to ignore. You're no longer part of the past as you were. You're reintroduced as someone who evolved. Over time, this evolution becomes part of how you're remembered. Not as someone who was left behind, but as someone who moved forward with dignity. And dignity has a way of echoing long after contact ends. So understand this, you don't need to be loud to be remembered. When growth is real, silence carries it further than words ever could. One of the quiet truths about emotional attachment is that the mind doesn't process loss in a straight line. People expect feelings to fade steadily over time, but that's rarely how it works. Instead, emotions move in cycles. There are periods of distraction, relief, and even confidence where it feels like everything is resolved, and then unexpectedly, memory returns, often not at the beginning, but much later, right when someone believes they're fully past it. In the early stages after separation, the mind is focused on survival, it's protecting itself from discomfort. That's when rationalizations are strongest. It was for the best. I've moved on. I don't feel anything anymore. These thoughts aren't lies, they're defenses. They help the mind stabilize. But once stability is restored, the need for defense fades. And when the guard drops, honesty has space to surface. This is when memory hits hardest, not with chaos, but with clarity. The emotional noise is gone. There's no urge to react, no impulse to reach out, just a quiet recognition of what the connection truly meant. The mind starts revisiting moments not to relive them, but to understand them. It separates what was temporary from what was meaningful. And in that process, what mattered becomes undeniable. Nostalgia often gets misunderstood as weakness or regret. In reality, it's a sign of emotional integration. It means the experience has been processed enough to be remembered without pain. And that's why it often shows up later, not sooner. When the emotions are no longer overwhelming, the mind allows itself to revisit them. That's when your presence returns, not as longing, but as acknowledgement. What makes this phase powerful is that it's unforced. There's no external trigger demanding reflection. It happens internally during moments of stillness, a quiet evening, a familiar feeling, a pause in life, and suddenly the memory surfaces not because something is missing, but because something mattered. That distinction changes everything. This delayed recognition is also why people are often remembered more fondly with time. Distance removes defensiveness, it softens edges, it reveals patterns. And when someone realizes they felt safer, more grounded, or more understood with you than they do now, that realization carries weight. Not enough to rewrite the past, but enough to reshape how you're remembered. By this point, the memory of you is no longer tied to conflict or confusion. It's tied to growth, comparison, and emotional truth. You're remembered as someone who handled distance with maturity, who didn't demand closure, who continued forward without resentment. That combination is rare, and rarity makes memory durable. So if you ever wonder whether time worked against you, understand this time often works in your favor. Not immediately, not loudly, but honestly. And when the moment comes that she thinks she's fully over you, that's often when the truth of your impact finally settles in